what I want to do is talk about, well, I'll say that in a minute. Okay, so I've been a scientist for 36 years. I worked at the Aerospace Corporation, which is a FFRDC, or Federally Funded Research and Development Corporation, much like Jet Propulsion Labs, if you've heard of them. And under contract, the USAF Space and Missile Systems Center in Los Angeles, primarily involved in launching satellites. But in order to be a scientist there, what I had to do was sort of become a slave to this thing that I call facts or truth. There's people out there who you talk to who think satellites are fake, or the Earth is flat. We didn't go to the moon. There's this guy named Elon Musk who is spreading a myth that we're going to go to Mars. I can explain why that's impossible. There's people who think the dinosaurs went extinct about 5,000 years ago. Don't believe in evolution. And when I was a kid, the big thing was the Jetsons. We all had this magical future, which gave rise to this sort of ideology of technical optimism, technological optimism, where the future's always going to be wonderful and great and bright, more bright and more great. But to do science, I had to become sort of a slave to these things called facts. I had a little demonstration I was going to show you in terms of facts. I mean, people argue about this. One troll said, there are no facts, there's only scientific theories. But it's like, no, there are facts. That's a piece of niobium for anyone who cares. Everyone, is there anyone who doesn't believe that's going to fall when I push it off the end of the table? No. Is anyone willing to get on the building and step off?
No.
Yeah.
Well, we'll give
so
you one.
This is what I call a fact. So that's this equation right here, Newton's law, one of them. And it says that the force between that and the Earth is directed along the axis. It's the product of the masses times the gravitational constant over the diameter of the Earth, radius of the Earth. So there's a bunch of laws like this that give rise to everything you know, everything we've learned to live with all our lives. MRIs, emergency rooms, electric motors, refrigerators, air conditioners. So I'm only going to talk about these kind of things. That was a simple version of the truth. It's about the simplest one I can show people. Maybe there's a better one, and if anyone thinks they know it, please tell me. But it's based on this equation. There's a set of equations here called the Maxwell's equations, which govern the way electromagnetics works, radios, cell phones. The Navier-Cauchy equations govern the strength of materials. Those are, see if I can get this in better focus. You know, you can't have a Harley-Davidson or a motorcycle if you don't know the Navier-Cauchy equations. These are the things that, for instance, the Wright brothers, they went out and made their own measurements because nobody knew how aerodynamics worked. So they made the measurements, came up with the equations, built their airplane, and it was the first one to fly. The federal government had a program going. They didn't bother to make the measurements, so theirs never flew. There's the Arrhenius equation, which governs chemistry in your body, in the atmosphere, everywhere where there's chemistry. There's the Navier-Stokes equations, which govern flow. For instance, here's air flowing around a sports car. Now, if you solve the Navier-Stokes equations with the Arrhenius equations, you get internal combustion engines, such as a rocket engine or that's an automobile or a diesel engine. So these are lots and lots of facts like that one that are assembled by scientists in order to know things. Before I go any further, that was, I know, like a lot of talk. But for those of you who don't know, there was a decision in Florida appellate court in 2003, the Acri versus New World Communications, which set a precedent, a legal precedent, saying that the U.S. News doesn't have to tell the truth.
The U.S. what?
U.S. News does no wrong when it distorts the truth, I believe was the actual wording. You can download the PDF of the decision.
But Canada has no such law.
It has the Radio Protection Act, which says that the news must tell the truth. So the U.S. News cannot legally broadcast in Canada, although there are people, there are corporate entities now trying to influence the Canadian government to remove the Radio Protection Act. There was actually a referendum that was sent around in Canada saying, do you want this stupid law? And they said, of course we do. But I was talking to trolls on Tuesday, and they actually said, I can see why you wouldn't want to tell the truth on the news. thinking, boy, their mind is really twisted. And then the last thing is the unity of scientific knowledge. Facts have a certain unity to them. There's room over here if you want to sit out of the sunlight, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
So basically all these laws work together and reinforce each other. There's a unity there. They're not a bunch of disparate ideas. Somebody said something? No, please just stop me and say stuff. So first, some light entertainment. This is the kind of stuff I did. I was going to play you a video. I was lucky enough just before I left work to get on the BBC. They came here and did this. So this is the peak of my career right there. That's the ugliest picture I've ever seen. But it was cool. And this is what we did. I built this thing to simulate a Russian upper stage. There's over 150 Russian upper stages, derelict, floating around. And we have billions of dollars worth of satellites that we use for everything. When there's a collision, there's a big problem. So one of my scientific research things was to do this. Now here it is, and we're going to see a penetrator coming in here at orbital velocity, 7 kilometers a second. That's what happens. So it's not like that movie that they had. Turns it into a plasma. And in fact, wow, I've never seen that before.
Russian hacking.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you know, I mean, we can talk about all kinds of things, but all of this is directly demonstrable. It doesn't show up very well here, but here's the chemistry that we were able to measure and so forth. So this is a kind of a fun thing that I was doing back in the day. Here's another thing. This is a rocket. This is entirely solved in a computer. This is a grid, and each point solves the Navier-Stokes equations and the Arrhenius equations. This is a slice through the computational grid, and this is what comes out of the computer. We solve for the way chemistry works in the atmosphere during hypersonic flight of these rockets. Yet another fun thing. Here's me out, that's my hand there, with my equipment out in the field looking at a rocket getting ready to launch and taking data. I was going to show you some data from that, but I didn't think I'd get that much time to speak here. Here's another fun thing. This is, oops, sorry, this is my 4,000-pound thrust rocket engine here, which is about 7 inches in diameter and about that long. And we were out doing research on it. I think I should have clicked, but it jumped to the other slide.
Is that ethyl alcohol?
So this is running on methanol. So, and here's another one. This was out there in the field taking data. This is about a 2-foot diameter rocket engine, and it's about 8 feet long, 10 feet long, and it's a solid rocket motor. 20,000 pounds thrust, and that's why space is hard. Here's my rocket engine again. So this time it's LOX kerosene. So it's full of soot, and you can see a brown layer right here. That's the film coolant from the engine that then ignites right here and burns. Here the liquid oxygen is turned off, and now it's making PM 2.5. That's another term for soot. It's 2.5 micron diameter soot. But now the way soot is made is here. This is time. You're starting down here with kerosene fuel. It oligomerizes because there's not enough oxygen. We turned off the LOX to burn it all the way. You know, that's what happens. You take away the oxygen, you get the soot. And it oligomerizes and forms these chicken wire structures and eventually the soot. But it's producing these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are carcinogens. So this is why they cleaned up diesel engines, if you remember. You know, when I was a kid, you see all this diesel smoke going along. Okay, people were getting deep lung cancer from that. And it was because of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So now you know about PM 2.5. Here's a Saturn V taking off from the Apollo era. This is a low-speed photograph. So here's the ignition sequence. It ignites fuel-rich, so there's not very much oxygen. So you see all the PM 2.5 being made. And then I cut out the middle of the film to shorten this. It'll jump forward to just before liftoff. So what's happening here is there's launch restraints here that you'll see pop back once all the engines have spun up to full power. And then you'll see the thing start to lift off. There go the launch restraints. This is ice dropping off the outside of the liquid oxygen tank, because liquid oxygen is really cold. So the gas generator flow and the film coolants are actually obscuring the plume. And after a short time, like in my engine, they ignite and burn. So this is all the soot burning up, all the PM 2.5. And then here's Elon Musk, who resurrected basically the least efficient rocket engine that's ever been built. And this is steam coming off the launch pad cooling water, and then this black stuff is PM 2.5. So his test stand is 4 miles from the McGregor High School. Of course, this isn't as big and as bad as Trump's thing, but you can see that there's people who are perfectly fine with this travesty. And I don't know where they are. They're partially in the EPA, partially in the government, partially in the military. But we have no way of knowing. And then this is steam. So he's doing that once a week. This is now in orbit. This is the engine in upper stage. And you can see the brown stuff coming out. So he's spraying all that PM 2.5 into orbit, where we have about $20 billion worth of satellites right now, ranging from GPS to weather satellites, other things like that. They're all going to be contaminated by this stuff now. But again, we're ignoring that. There's this conspiracy of silence, much like in this country there's a conspiracy of silence about climate change. So that was the entertainment. Now we're going to talk about climate change. The ending Holocene. How many know what the Holocene is? Yeah, so I'll show you in just a moment. So when I was born, nobody had ever seen the Earth before. This picture, Earthrise, if you remember, was taken during the Apollo era. And it was the first time humans had ever seen our little planet out there in the middle of nowhere. And this is, many credit this with giving rise to the environmental movement. And it was a Republican who gave us the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and other things. And then this is, that little blue dot there is our home. So Voyager 1 is beyond the heliopause right now, several billion miles out there. And I don't know if I can read that. I was going to read that.
What is the Holocene, Patty? Can you explain?
Just about to get there.
Oh, okay.
Can you hold on just a second? So on this blue dot is everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of. Every human being who ever was lived out their lives on that dot. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and gatherer, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor, explorer, can't read the rest of it, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every saint, every sinner, all lived out their lives on that little dot in the middle of nowhere. Now, there's a lot of people who believe in, large-eyed grays and things like that. So that's again a belief. The aliens, that's again a belief. Okay. So I'm only going to confine myself to talking about things that we know. Okay. So now I'm going to mention the Holocene. Okay. This is the last 450,000 years of temperature on the Earth. There's 2 lines here. Those are from 2 different Antarctic ice cores. The ice traps little bubbles of air. So when they drill an ice core and pull it out, they can actually track the temperature of the atmosphere going back that far. This is the Holocene, the last little bit. This is going back 450,000 years to the present. We were the first large animal to cross open ocean to Australia. And within several thousand years, I'm standing right in front of my camera. Within several thousand years, the megafauna was gone. Okay, there were large sloths. The other one I can remember is a marsupial lion. Okay, we were the first to enter the Americas. There were horses and camels, other creatures like that, mammoths. And within several thousand years after us showing up, the megafauna is gone. So you're beginning to see a theme here in the way humans respond to their world. Okay, then what I think of as a miracle happened right about here. The Earth learned how to stabilize temperature somehow. So this is the Holocene. It hasn't varied by very much, about a degree C for over 10,000, well, about 10,000 years. Okay, as soon as that appeared, we developed agriculture, and then not too long after that, large civilizations. So the interpretation is that everything around you depends on the Holocene. And Rockström and his group in Scandinavia talks about the importance of preserving the Holocene, because our civilization operates based on agriculture, which only operates in a stable climate. If you don't know whether there's going to be a crop in the summer, you can't have a civilization. So this is why I mentioned the Holocene earlier. I'll skip that, but I'll mention this. So these are called thermal or greenhouse mass extinctions. Basically, all the previous mass extinctions, except for the Chicxulub event, were blamed on volcanic CO2 being put into the air that changed the environment enough to cause mass extinctions. The biggest one was right here, the end-Permian mass extinction. Half of all, well, 95% by some estimates of all life in land and ocean disappeared. There are some dramatists who say that we barely escaped, having a sterile Earth at that point. The reason I show this is because we're actually heading for another one now, we believe. So here's the last 400,000 years again. This shows the Ice Age cycles. This is carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So we're the first non-volcanic event that's causing a huge spike in the CO2 concentration. And we know it's from us because of the isotope effect. There's C12 and C13 are two isotopes of carbon. And in nature, they exist in a fixed ratio. So whenever a volcano erupts, you get this 99% C12, 1% C13 in the CO2 that comes out of that volcanic eruption. Now life forms, when they use carbon, they absorb preferentially C12. So whenever you burn a life form, like coal or oil, you get predominantly C12. So we actually know the amount. We know where the CO2 is coming from. We know it's coming from burning of fossil fuels. There's several other things too, but I tend to go on, so I won't. So that's a concern. So this is the COP21 in Paris. That was in 2015. The US was part of 195 countries that joined that.
Je regarde la salle, je vois que la réaction est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Those are the sounds from the moment when the Paris Agreement was struck, when delegates representing 195 countries from around the world reached a landmark deal to limit greenhouse gas emissions.
That's carbon dioxide.
To the agreement. But at its core was the declaration that the nations of the world would collectively take action to keep the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The accord was heralded as historic by the media and by politicians, but in some ways it was incredibly short on specifics about how we're going to get there.
So this is actually what was agreed to in the COP21, and it's not very specific, it's more general, and the problem is you're trying to get 195 countries who basically don't like each other and don't want to get along to try and save civilization, because that's really what's at stake here. That's the only way you're going to get them to cooperate. Imagine trying to get the Saudis to stop selling oil. Yeah. But it was done. And it was done, there's some detailed conversations. But what was agreed upon was to stay well below 2 degrees C, not a 50-50 chance of, but well below. Try and stay below 1.5 degrees C. Use the best science, which is why I'm standing here, on the basis of equity, which I think is really important from the point of view of this group. Since we're spiritual, what would you do if you had this kind of knowledge that we're in really deep doo-doo, nobody wants to hear it? Would you just keep it to yourself and go away, or would you try and tell the story? That's a question that's been bugging me for some years now. Input appreciated, by the way. So this is every thermometer reading in North America. And they're just piled on there, so it's what's called a frequency curve. So most frequent temperature is here, least frequents are on the outside. So 51 to 80, 83 to 93, 94 to 2004, and 2005 to 2015. So you can see it's warming, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is down here. Extremely hot days have been increasing from nothing to something like a fifth of all days. So the European heat wave killed tens of thousands in a modern industrialized country. The Soviet heat wave did a similar sort of thing. We lost a substantial portion of our grain crop, I think it was in 2012. So this is the real problem, and this is going to continue. But I'm going to skip this. This is just saying that the temperature is just a proxy for impacts. We don't care that much about temperature. What we care about is the problem it causes us. So these are some impacts from 2016 in Vietnam and India, asphalt melting. These are just some things you can pull down off the interwebs. In Australia and Great Britain, they're smarter, they kept their rail systems. But even rails can't handle these heat waves. So you have one real bad heat wave, and suddenly you have to go out and fix your rail lines. This is Canada. The Fort McMurray fire erased a town 3 times the size of Prescott. There's nothing they could do to stop that fire. You know, 2016 Phoenix, airplanes couldn't fly because they're just not designed to fly under those conditions, and yet that's what we're expecting. So how much destabilization will these sorts of things cause? We don't really know.
Well, what happened last year in Saudi Arabia? Remember they had that really spiked heat wave? What was some of the repercussions of that?
I don't know, but when I worked for the U.S. Air Force, part of the work that we had to do was support air bases. And they're drawing up plans right now to build giant domes. Nobody knows if it's going to go through. We don't know if we have enough money to do so. Because they're expecting that part of the world to become essentially uninhabitable, like the Sahara. Thank you. Sahara Desert. So they want to build giant concrete domes for and then they just fly the planes out. This is just somebody's idea. We don't know if it's going to happen. There were a lot of weird things discussed, like we actually discussed going to Mars. And there's a few problems with that, like there's no magnetic field, so that means the solar wind will sterilize anybody who's on the surface, if they even survive. Did I say no solar wind? There's no magnetic field, so the solar wind can. There's also, I shouldn't go off talking about that. So this is what's actually going on. So now this isn't models at all, this is what's actually going on. Now they've got some pretty good predictive capabilities. We expect 2018 to be a little cooler. 2019 will be back up, maybe slightly above 2017. But you can't really predict too much beyond that. So I put this on my sign for the Tuesday thing out there to show these trolls who come by, and anybody who wants to argue about it. There's sincere arguers, and then there's trolls. And the trolls were okay with this, but they said, we don't really care. But what's interesting here is it held steady up until we started cleaning up the U.S. air, because aerosols, acid rain, and so forth. So, and then it made a nice linear climb, but now it looks like it might be running away again. So we're talking about sometime between 2060 to 2100 hitting like 2.3 degrees C global average temperature. Now, since the world is about half water and half land, most of that temperature change takes place on land, not on water. So it's actually 4.6 degrees C on land. And then if you convert to Fahrenheit, you get 8 degrees. So we're basically talking about, within the lifetime of the youngest members in this room, hitting something like 110 routinely in Prescott. And maybe a bad heat wave of 115. I mean,
and what were those years again?
2060, thereabouts. But see, that's just taking the data now. There's a whole group of millions, billions of dollars have been spent on computer models. I'm not talking about that. But we know there's serious flaws in our models, but we also know those flaws cause them to underestimate this. So that's why I went ahead and took the liberty of extrapolating that way. And the reason is there's a kink here, and I'm postulating it looks like there's a kink here also, so it's going to go up that path rather than that one. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence for that. One of that is the polar caps melting. So our climate doesn't care about the efficiency of cars and equipment. It doesn't care about green technologies or renewable power. It doesn't care about human welfare or politics. It only cares about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases are cumulative and build up year upon year, persisting for thousands of years. So what we've already released is going to stay there for a really long time. So who exactly is doing this CO2 emitting? And here's something a lot of people don't want to hear. Okay, about 700 million people are responsible for about half of all the carbon dioxide. Another 3 billion people are responsible for less than half. And then 3.5 billion are responsible for essentially nothing. So it's not a population problem. It's actually an affluence problem, because these are the affluent people. They're the top 10% of the world. And if you look here, 18% Americans here, 3% Americans there. So it's basically us. And then looking a little closer, half of all Americans are basically in poverty. So it's not them. Okay? It's basically the more money you spend, it's basically the affluent. The more money you spend, the larger your carbon footprint. Climate change is a problem of affluence, not population. Now, who in America wants to hear that? What politician is going to say that? And I suspect that may be giving a lot of strength to someone like Trump, because he knows nobody wants to hear this. And people know about it. But yeah, just speak out. It's okay.
Yeah, but the big question I have is around the emotional impact of being below the poverty line. It's like, ooh, not me, not my family. So I would lie and cheat and do anything, exaggerate and use my money in such a way so that you think that I may not be really affluent, but I'm not below the poverty line. And I think that's kind of I would suspect that's pretty broad. So when you talk about something like this, you're hitting right at people's egos. You know, I'm going to be a Republican because Republicans have more money, more status. So my uncle did.
Okay. Yeah, well, that never occurred to me.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. So it's very difficult to find a way of making it safe. And I think all of this is a matter of arousing people's curiosity and making it safe to entertain a new idea.
It's possible. I think basically everybody is trying to figure out how to get this put across. What we have to do is get back into the Paris Accords. And that plays into the whole get rid of Trump thing.
Yeah, totally. Okay, perfect.
And Patty, I was going to ask you, it showed on your graph that stabilized temperatures were about, is agriculture got invented when the temperatures started to stabilize. So I have a lot of these alt people saying to me, the temperatures have always gone up and down and the ages have always come and gone, but they're not taking into consideration the stabilized temperatures that allow us to grow food.
That's why you have to memorize the
have not been forever, and they are only what we're in right now, and we don't know how to survive when they're not stable.
That's why you have to memorize the word Holocene. I mean, see, this is what's important about getting facts. And that's why I wanted to bring Diane here, because she's very political. I don't do that stuff. Okay, so there's two paths forward, and I'll wind this up quickly. Randy already left, and it's not even... Okay, we can pass, this is what we're doing in the US right now, pass the problem on to our kids and hope they can solve it, right? There's no physics in that, period. That's just some sort of thing we're doing because we're afraid to look at ourselves and change ourselves. Or, and this is the hard part, sorry it starts here folks, rapidly change ourselves, our behavior, our financial system, to decrease the rate of release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, halting it completely by about 2040. That's not a long time away. I'm going to show you. As of 2017, we can release more than about 800 billion tons of carbon. 90% of the remaining oil and coal in the ground has to stay in the ground.
Really? Is
If we-
that much?
That much. And if we burn that, I'll show you what's going to happen.
Wow.
So, physics always wins in the end. I mean, we could talk about Trump till we're blue in the face. The physics will always win. There's nothing you can do to change that. It's worked fine for 13 billion years running our universe. Okay, so this is rate of release in gigatons per year of carbon dioxide. That's what you can measure. How much gasoline did you sell that got burnt? So many gallons per year. And then this is year. So way back when we first knew there was a problem in the 1990s, we actually knew about it before then, but it took that long to get political will to have things happen. The UN Climate Change Panel, and then we've had several other climate change panels, and yet our rate of release keeps going up, even during the financial collapse. You know,
But this is global.
right.
Yeah.
So despite that, but it was a global economic downturn. There were countries, remember Greece? I mean, the countries were worried. Banks had to be beefed up everywhere. We just notice it because we're Americans. We really only pay attention to America. Peripherally, we pay attention to
The
America.
economic collapse, when?
08.
Uh-huh. Oh, well,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So,
Well, I remember.
so this, remember now, this is the rate. It's not the absolute amount. That's the absolute amount. It's the area under there. So that's the gigatons. The slope of this curve going up like that is the gigatons per year. So we can't change that. That amount of carbon is already in the atmosphere. It's going to be there for thousands of years. But we have this. Here we are. This is a little closer. This is the historic curve, amount of carbon that's been released. So we can take one of three paths. If we just keep going like we're going, they're going to release this much carbon. We're eventually going to hit 8 degrees C, which is more like 40-degree heat waves. At that point, probably we're going to have another thermal greenhouse mass extinction. That's why I showed that previous slide before. That's if we keep going like we are now. The COP21 is aiming more for this. Now that's going to be severe, but the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the reinsurers think maybe we can keep our system dragging along at 3 or 4 degrees C. But that's an opinion, that's not a fact. And then 2 degrees C is what everyone has decided is like where we want to hit. Probably it's the best we can do right now. There's no way we can do any better than 2 degrees C, which comes out to be 8 degrees, right? According to that, 8 degrees F, average on land. But that's this much carbon. And the only way we can do that is to turn this curve down and rapidly decrease our rate of release of carbon dioxide. Here's this slide is the most important slide in here. We only have 10 years to do that, to turn this curve over. Okay, yeah. That's, in my opinion, why we're here. I mean, we can talk about spirituality and so forth as a means, but this is actually what we're trying to do. Is I have grandkids, and I want them to have antibiotics and medical care and all that, and we can't keep our civilization going. So this is why we need to get rid of Trump. And get back in the Paris Accord and try and do this. Because the rest of the world, 194 nations, are trying.
Yeah.
But without a strong leader like the U.S. used to be, they're looking to China now, hoping China will take over leadership, global leadership. But
Many American companies are still doing it. They're not listening to Trump.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
states
Yeah, they
have
are.
done that,
Yeah.
towns have done that.
States,
Um,
that's true.
27 states.
Yeah.
But we may be able to do that here. Maybe that's something we want to consider doing, because if we don't do something like that, then we have to pay attention to what we're actually doing. We have to stop using plastics. We have to stop air travel. We have to stop vehicle travel. I mean, a lot. Not just drive one day less a week.
They've outlawed plastic in Hawaii.
So-
Yeah.
We want to switch to electricity, because at least electricity you can get from windmills and solar cells, but there's huge effort involved in that. I mean, tripling the size of the grid.
Don't you need a lot of rare metals in order to?
For solar cells, not so
Yeah.
much for wind power. There's also tidal power. They want to build this pump storage facility. That's another thing, because solar cells don't create energy at night, so you have to store it somewhere. And the only known technology for storing enough energy to run a city is a pump storage facility. And so
What
we're
does
not
that
talking.
look like?
Well, it's the two lakes at different altitudes,
Oh.
and then they pump it up to this one during the day, pulling energy off the grid, and then at night they let it run back down and generate energy to put back on the grid, so we have lights at night. So it just pump, let run, pump, generate, pump, generate. That's the only way you can store enough energy to run a city.
I wondered about geothermal, since
Iceland uses a lot of geothermal,
Yeah.
but they're sitting right on top of active
Yeah.
volcanoes, and they're pretty small compared to us.
I mean, there's a huge amount of energy down there. It's just too far away, is that?
Yeah, I think the deepest we've been is a couple of miles with a drill bit like that. The Russians did it, actually, the koala borehole. So, I mean, there are many different things that can be done, but first thing is to recognize the problem, right?
I think that to realize this is rate, this isn't amount.
Yeah.
And I imagine that many people, when they see a -2 or something, they think, oh, that's solvable. It's rate. It doesn't get rid of stuff. It just gets...
That's right. That's why I said it's in there for thousands of years before it gets pulled out. So there's no way we can avoid 2 degrees C at this point. We want to try and keep it to that. This is what it looks like. If we had started in 2011, it would be a gentle slope to cut down the rate. We wait till 2020, it's the beginning, it'll look like a brick wall. And then at some point we overshoot it and, you know, 2 billion people die in the global south. Do we care about that? Do we care about apartheid? And this gets into the spiritual nature now.
And I've also heard about mass migrations from the equator.
But right now,
I don't know.
I just...
We know they're not going along with
They
this.
have good programs on PBS, their science programs are pretty accurate.
The problem is nobody told you on any of those about this, did they?
They've hinted.
Not hinted, yeah, that doesn't work. Michio Kaku, Tyson, none of the people speak about this because they know they won't be on the air the next day.
Yeah.
Oh.
Too scary.
Oh.
Well, possibly. I think humans can survive under scary conditions. I think we did for 100,000 years.
But at least the Koch brothers are mentioning and they're softening. You know,
We have 10 years.
I know that, but if you try to push people from here to here, you lose them. It's too much.
It's possible.
Most people develop their belief
The
systems
physics
over
always
a long
wins,
period.
though.
Physics may win. I'm
No,
talking
it will
about
win.
psychology.
Right, so
So
if you don't convince the people and you have billions dying, see, that's the problem. You're caught between a rock and a hard place. It's literally a predicament. And I think, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people in government who are just like what you said. This is too scary, we can't tell people. Instead, we'll manipulate them using the Fox News and so forth and get them to do what we want. The problem is those kind of people are also poisoning high schools. I gave you an example with Elon Musk. So, do we want to be manipulated or do we want to know the truth? Now, I don't know what the Koch brothers are done.
Because we're built to tolerate that.
But for instance, you could possibly, we don't know that. All we know is in the last 100 years it's worked very well. I would check and see if the Koch brothers had built a compound in New Zealand or some other place. Now you might have to actually go to the New Zealand Registry of Land Management or something like that. There's billionaires who are building compounds in New Zealand. They're going to write out the coming thing, which won't work, by the way. But they're not well informed enough. They believe their own garbage, apparently. This fellow who did After the Storm or Before the Storm, what was his name, the actor? Thank you, DiCaprio. Yeah, his carbon footprint is 1,000 Americans or 20,000 Zimbabweans. So by him living his lifestyle, he's denying the future of that many people, and he's okay with that.
Yes.
You know, private yacht, private jet, private helicopter, private island, and so this is the mentality of some. The problem is I don't even know what goes on in this church, and I'm in here every week. So I don't know at all what goes on in Washington. I mean, I know what the news tells me goes on, but I don't know. So, and that's something we have to bear in mind, our own finiteness and how difficult it took me 10 years to uncover most of this stuff. So I left my job, took an early retirement. I really like doing science, but this meant enough to me. So I got my carbon footprint down to half the average American's carbon footprint. But this is where we need to be if we're going to keep it to 2 degrees C. So I've kind of like started giving these presentations around. As you say, we're caught between I think Kaku and, but they would say, look, if you get me off the air by telling the truth, then I won't be able to spread. So there's arguments, and I'm sure there's Republicans who feel the same way. There's a Republican who said to me that he didn't care, that he thought it was appropriate the news should be able to lie. And I'm sure what he was thinking is the news needs to manipulate the people to keep the peace. I'm already way over time.
Oh,
So
but that's okay.
there are things, well, it's not for everybody. So this is how I see the future. This is boiling out the transition town movement. Several people are now saying, save your town. That's where your political power is strongest. This group is in this town, so this is where you can make the biggest effect. Local food movement, it's happening all over the country. If we have,
That's why I leave early.
Yeah, we
Yes.
see it here.
so we need to support this and talk about it in context of our future. Maybe that would be a way to avoid the scary part. But I thought you all were mentally strong enough to see the truth. You don't always have to ram this down everybody's throat. Transition town movement, there's transition towns all over the world. University Press of Kentucky, Yale University Press, on how to bottoms up create a stable community that can endure the shocks that are coming. Baltimore Food System. Read that book if you really want to understand what's coming our way. But it discusses more psychological kind of things, how you reach people, the difficulties people are having in dealing with that problem.
What's the name of that book, Ken?
It's the Post-Carbon Reader. I'm sorry, Community Resilience Reader.
Okay.
There it is, okay.
And it's online as a free PDF now. Yeah. We probably don't want our federal government telling us how to live in Prescott. They don't know how in the first place. But Arizona State University is granting masters in community resilience. And our own Prescott College, environmental studies and sustainability. So we do have local resources that we can begin to talk to. If you remember nothing, remember this. We've got like 10 years. I'm sorry.
10 years before the
Before we blow the
temperatures.
2 degree C budget.
Yeah.
The problem is you won't notice it probably in your lifetimes. Kathy will live in it, and my grandchildren will live in it.
Don't worry about it.
So I've had people who said to me, I'll be dead by then. And I'm
Oh,
like,
that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
well, yes, but I think it goes back to what you're saying, which is it terrifies people, as it should.
But there's also a concept, my husband was a researcher, and he was always talking about elegance in terms of design. Now, I have a part of me that's an artist, and I know of elegance in terms of design on a piece of canvas. And it's something that has guided me over the years.
Sorry.
How can I live gracefully with less and have elegance in my life? Having a lot of gadgets is not elegant.
Yes.
So there are decisions that I've made throughout. And I did live in a third world. I lived in Trinidad in the 60s. And I could see how little I really needed in order to live. And live well.
Yes.
But it has to be taught. You have to be exposed to it. And that's not scary. It's actually a relief not to need all this stuff that you have to sit shotgun over. Yeah, I understand.
If anyone tells you we're going to use a technology to get us out of this problem, there's no large-scale technology that we can implement in 10 years. That's why we have to do what you said, which is learn to decrease our own carbon footprint. And the richer you are, the more it is. And it's really hard to see because we're non-homogeneous. There's an 80-20 rule. 20% of the people here are responsible for 80% of the carbon footprint. There's that much differentiation among different people.
And they're totally unaware of it. They're doing other things, they're thinking other thoughts. Right.
Yeah, I wonder how much they are actually unaware, how much they're just refusing to think about it.
No, I think they're unaware, their lives are very
Willful
complete.
ignorance is what people call that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, to me, I
That's
could
all
be
I have
wrong,
to
but
say.
whenever I started hearing about climate deniers, the first thing that pops in my head are these people. I don't have anything against money. Money gives you choices, but these people's greed has gone into the level of insanity. This is insanity we're talking about
There's
here.
psychological studies. that
And
show-
wanting to make money now.
Okay, there's
and forget the
psychological
future.
studies that show that people who, have a lot of money, including people who inherit a lot of money, feel that they're entitled to that money.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
If their
Seems to
family
be a
had it, they
flaw
think
in
that
the
they've got some inbred specialness.
Yeah, I can have as many children as I want, it doesn't matter because I can afford them and I can put them in the best schools. And you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, I'll wave at you when you make it.